So as I mentioned, I spent this week in New London, Iowa, and surrounding area in southeast Iowa. And it's, of course, harvest time in southeast Iowa, so that meant that I was traveling around the countryside, pointing out combines in the field to interested riders in my vehicle, and dodging tractors and wagons that are just these hulking, massive things on the roadways. The same harvest is happening here in southwest Wisconsin, but it's different in Iowa. And it's not just because it's my home state. It's just different. The glaciers missed us here in southwest Wisconsin, leaving beautiful hills and valleys that are speckled with spotted cows. But the glaciers made up for their omission by pounding and polishing the landscape of this part of Iowa. So it's smooth and flat as the bottom of a pasty down there. When you drive through this part of Iowa in the fall, the only variation of landscape that you see is the difference in height between the tall cornfields and the short bean fields. That is, until the combines come out. Now, once those giant munching machines enter the fields, this variety of the landscape starts to disappear. It's eaten away, and because it's so flat, you feel this emptiness in the land. We don't notice that as much here because there's always a hill that rises above the valley, or there's always a pasture with cows that's left after harvest. But in Iowa, or this part, it's different. It's completely corn and beans. The gigantic gleaners gulp down everything, and you see nothing for miles. The only thing they spare is a naked house or a lonely barn. And the rest of the land is licked clean. By Thanksgiving, there's nothing but a flat, fenceless wasteland. Now, as I watched the combines inhale every last stalk of grain this week, it dawned on me that the harvest we see in Ruth would look different. Not only because the ancient harvest was conducted on a human scale and required human labor as massive as any machine that we use today, but primarily this harvest would be visually different because in the biblical time, some grain was left in the fields. Some stalks were left standing. Now, we'd call it waste today, and every year engineers at John Deere scramble to eliminate it, and they've done so to the point that tractors have GPS now and steer on their own, planting the fields more efficiently than any farmer could. Any grain or space wasted is the ultimate folly, if not offensive sin. But in biblical times, leaving some grain in the field wasn't seen as folly, it was the law. It was justice. And it sets the stage for this chapter from Ruth for today. I'm going back to Leviticus again. I haven't quoted it in a couple weeks. I'm kind of missing that book of the Bible, so here we go. Leviticus 19, 9 through 10 says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest, the leftovers. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God." Similarly, in Deuteronomy 24:19, we read this. "When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be left for the poor, the alien, the orphan, the widow. Remember, you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I am commanding you to do this." So Ruth has traveled from Moab, her home, across the border into Israel to journey to Bethlehem with Naomi. Now, there's no legal or illegal immigration in this time. Everyone simply knows that Naomi belongs and Ruth doesn't. But they come to Bethlehem at the beginning of the harvest, which means that even though women are vulnerable in biblical times, they can't earn money on their own, because it's harvest time, Ruth can go to the field and pick up some leftover grain that will be enough to feed her and Naomi, at least for a while. Once Ruth goes out to the field, we see a combination of Ruth's initiative, the generosity of Boaz, and the providence or grace of God. And it's hard to know exactly where one begins and the other one ends. So Ruth goes out to the barley fields, and we're told that Ruth just happens to go to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. She just happens to go there. And Boaz is a relative of Naomi's dead husband Elimelech. He's a distant relative, but a relative nonetheless. Just by chance, she ends up there. Scholar Kathleen Robertson Farmer says that providence, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder, which I think is very true. As people of faith who are looking for the movement of God in our lives, chance happenings that lead to what we really need are increasingly seen as the grace of God, a slight nudge from God's pinky finger moving things along for us. Now we're on notice as a reader. God's moving in this story, but much will depend on what the characters do in response. Well, the day that Ruth gets started gleaning, Boaz comes to the field to monitor progress. He says to the servant in charge, "So who's that young woman over there?" And the servant says, "That's that Moabite that came back with Naomi." It's interesting how he identifies her. He doesn't need to explain. It's assumed that everybody knows this Moabite. Everybody knows there's a foreigner around. When I was in college, my home church in my hometown had an interim pastor. Now, my town's 700 people, and the interim pastor we had was a black preacher from the South. Okay? You didn't have to call Charles by name to talk to. Everybody knew that, well, that UCC preacher. Everybody knew he was different. It's the same with Ruth. Ruth's a Moabite. She's in town. The servant continued, "She asked to glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers." Now, gleaning is within the letter of the law. That's just picking up the leftovers. But when Ruth asks to gather among the sheaves, she's pushing a little bit. This is the gathered harvest that's for the owner. God's given her an opportunity, and she's aggressive. And we wonder how Boaz will respond. Will he correct her, which is well within his right? Or will he send her off because she's a foreigner? Or will he be more generous? Well, Boaz finds Ruth and says to her, "Don't go to another field or leave this one. Stay close to my young women and follow behind them. And I've ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, drink from the water the young men drink from." Upon hearing this, Ruth falls to the ground, grateful, and says, "Why have I found favor in your sight? I'm an alien in the land." And Boaz says, "I've heard all that you've done for your mother-in-law, Naomi. May God reward you for your deeds. And may you have a full reward for your deeds from the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Another clue from the story that this is indeed God's movement here through this work of Boaz. Then at mealtime, Boaz says to Ruth, "Come here and eat some of this bread." And he directs her to sit by the reapers, doing the real work of the harvest. And he gives her a heap of parched grain, perhaps a tenth of an ephah, which is an 11th of a homer or a bushel or whatever. Who knows the measurement, but it's a heap. It's right there on her plate. And she eats until she's satisfied. And there are leftovers. Right? That's the language of God providing manna in the wilderness and God feeding the 5,000. When God miraculously provides, there are leftovers. Now, when she gets up to go to glean, Boaz says to the reapers, "Let her glean even among the standing sheaves, and don't bother her. Pull out a few stalks from the bundles every once in a while. Make it really easy for her. And again, don't bother her." Here's a wealthy and powerful man giving the most vulnerable of women more than she asks for. I wonder why Boaz is so generous. He doesn't have to be. And there are clues in the story telling us that his generosity would be no more popular in his time than it would be in ours. After all, he has to tell the workers 3 times not to harass Ruth out in the field.